So we're coming up in a few years on the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which of course gave women nationally the right to vote. In anticipation of that centennial, Angela Dodson has put together quite a valuable sort of almanac titled Remember the Ladies, that documents the long struggle for suffrage for women in this country. How long? The very title of the book recalls what Abigail Adams is reported to have said to her husband John at the time of the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. She urged him to remember to write rights for women into that seminal document. Drawing on a range of sources, including letters, speeches, newspaper accounts, photos, drawings, Angela highlights the milestones in the historic push for women's voting rights. Her book provides portraits of a number of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement and places that movement in the context of other major social and political developments that were unfolding. Today, more women than men tend to turn out to vote. But lest anyone think the fight is over, just recall the massive turnout on the Mall last January, reaffirming women's rights and effectively protesting Donald Trump's election. Angela has lots of experience herself reporting and telling newsworthy stories. She's a veteran journalist who, after starting with Gannett News Service and following stints at the Washington Star and Courier Journal, landed at the New York Times. There she rose from copy editor to become the first African-American woman promoted to a senior editor position at the Times. She left the paper about 2 decades ago, and in the intervening years has written for or edited various publications, including a Black Issues Book Review. And she also has edited or ghostwritten a number of books. Now, Angela will be in conversation here this evening with 2 other accomplished journalists, Carol Richards, who is a founding editor of USA Today and currently a lecturer at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs, and Dorothy Gilliam, who, of course, has been a longtime columnist for the Washington Post and is herself writing a memoir at the moment that is due out a little more than a year from now. So we hope to see her back for that. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Angela, Carol, and Dorothy.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dorothy Gilliam, as you've just heard, and it's a real pleasure to be here at Politics and Prose, a very eminent Politics and Prose, and it's very good to welcome all of you. We're excited about Angela Dodson's new book, Remember the Ladies. And before I turn it over and ask Angela some questions, I wanted to take a moment to introduce someone else who was very important in the production of this book. She's Angela's editor from Hachette Book Group, Adrian Ingram. Would you stand for just a moment to wave your hands? Thank you, thank you. Angela, I think like many people, I thought I knew something about the suffrage movement until I read your very riveting book. Can you give 5 or 6 of the key moments in the suffrage movement?
Yes, I too thought I knew something about the movement until I started actually trying to write about it. I would say the key moments are these, that Lucretia Mott, who's one of the leaders in the movement, always considered the first women's convention of the anti-slavery movement to be the beginning of the movement. And that was in 1938. The other seminal moment would have been when women began to start speaking in public. What did I say, 1838. I saw somebody shaking their head. The other seminal moment would have been when women started addressing public audiences, because women weren't supposed to, and women were not even allowed to speak in their churches except for the Quaker women. But a free woman of color began speaking out on things like the anti-slavery movement, but also on the education of girls and other public issues around 1831. And she was followed by two white women, Angela Grimke and Sarah Grimke, who had been born into slaveholding families, slaveholding family in South Carolina. They became Quakers and moved to Philadelphia and became very active in the anti-slavery movement. And they had to fight for the right to speak in public. They were roundly criticized. A group of ministers wrote an encyclical kind of thing condemning them for doing so. So that was another key moment. The 1848 Seneca Falls Convention of Women, which was called by mostly Quaker women, but also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was not Quaker. And within about a week and a half time, they conceived the meeting, called the meeting, publicized the meeting, and attracted 300 people there. The next seminal moment probably was, or period really, was from about 1850 to 1860. Women met annually in conventions. They had not settled on the vote as their key issue, so they weren't really calling themselves suffragists yet. But they kept meeting to talk about things like property rights and custody and divorce. And a lot of these women were also simultaneously involved in the temperance movement, which became a women's issue. So that was a big deal. The next seminal moment is when they split up after the Civil War, because some of the women want to support the 14th and 15th Amendments giving black men who had been enslaved the right to vote. And some of them did not want to work for that unless the women's vote was going to be included. And at that point, they were told that that was not on the table and that it was the Negro's hour. Some people, particularly Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, did not take well to that, and they formed an organization just to fight for women and suffrage. Another faction stayed with the 14th, 15th Amendment issue as well as the women's vote. So the next seminal moment really for me is when those two groups get back together 20 years later and finally have some energy to move forward. Then there's a period where the states began to get, more states began to give women the vote, and beginning in 1917, New York State voted for women's suffrage for voting in New York. And then there's some states that follow after that. So that's a key period. And then the final push is really ratification, which occurs with the final vote in Tennessee. And I devote a chapter just to winning in Tennessee.
I think the thing that struck me the most about this book was the vast expanse of time that Remember the Lady's Letter was written in 1776. It was almost 150 years later. 150 years later that women got the vote. 150 years, like that's a long time. And from the 150 years, it's been almost 100 years since Hillary Clinton ran for president and won the popular vote. And I'll tell you, the number of times the women in the suffrage program that Angela was talking about, the number of times that they got hope above hope that they were going to get there, and their hopes were dashed one time after another. You know, there's, okay, those Civil War came first. Okay, I get that. Well, black suffrage comes before that. Okay, I get that too. Well, and then there's all these other things that disturb them. I'm sorry. Did that help? I'm sorry. They didn't win, and they didn't win, and the fact is, we didn't win in 2016, even though we won the popular vote, which means that there's more work to do. And I just want to point out that another one of the things that's in Angela's book is that the majority of white American woman voters voted for Trump. So you see, this is not, it wasn't easy, it isn't easy, and it's not going to be easy.
Well, Angela, just to build on that, there were about 96% of African American women who voted for Hillary Clinton. So do you think it's possible that women are ever going to kind of get together and vote as a tribe so they can really elect a woman for president?
Right. That's funny. I've used the same term, tribe. I think they will, but it's going to take, maybe this administration is going to be a blessing in disguise. That, the fact that 53% of white women voted for Trump, particularly given the misogynistic campaigning and phrases that went around, grabbing things and whatever, and that 96% of women could still vote for Hillary, and black women who voted could vote for Hillary without concern for her race, particularly. People keep saying, well, some people thought that Hillary was a flawed candidate and therefore they couldn't vote for her. And my answer to that is always, and we have elected 45 flawed men. Now, one of them blessedly was an African American, but he was not perfect either. So we have to decide as women, when is it going to be important enough for us to do one for the girls? I got to put aside everything else and say it is more important, and in many ways it's more damning that our nation has never elected a woman than the fact that they had never elected an African American male. So if it's ever going to happen, women are going to have to hold together. But one of the lessons of this book also was that women couldn't do it alone. Many, many men appear in this book as having helped the movement at various times. Many men attended every conference. Frederick Douglass publicized the conference, went to the conference at Seneca Falls, stood up for the right for women to vote when no one else did. No one else stood with Elizabeth Cady Stanton when she put that resolution in to ask for that. And he wrote about it afterwards. But there are also all kinds of other abolitionist men who were involved. Men introduced the first legislation, the first versions of the Women's Rights Amendment into the Constitution. Men had to ratify it. There were no women who, except in a few states, territories, Wyoming, for instance, at the time, by the time the suffrage vote came around, New York women would have been able to vote in a few more states. But women were totally dependent on male helpers as well throughout most of this movement. In the early days, they didn't even want to run their own meetings because they had never run meetings. No one had ever presided over anything and didn't feel they knew how. They had never addressed a meeting. One woman at one of the Ohio conventions in about 1850, 1851, goes on to say, I could never speak in front of an audience, and I've never spoken, I've never attended a meeting or whatever, and she goes on to address the audience for about an hour, very eloquently. But that's how far we've had to come. But what we've learned is that there has to be some sort of coalition. But women are at some point are going to have to stand up and decide that we're a tribe because we are all women.
Well, I was also interested in the way the women related to President Woodrow Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
They really worked him.
Right.
And they worked him in an upward manner. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah. Woodrow Wilson was on record as being opposed to women's suffrage and was on record as having said very, very horrible things about his students at Bryn Mawr and what a waste of time it was to educate women, that kind of thing. So Alice Paul and a few of her friends organized the march before Wilson's inaugural, the day before, in 1913. And their whole campaign was to work on him specifically, to get him to turn around and support women's suffrage. After a while, they began picketing him and being at the White House every single day. And that in turn led to their arrest. After World War I started, there was less tolerance for their picketing. And they were arrested. Some of them were rearrested. They went on hunger strikes. They were force-fed. They were let go. They were arrested again. And that went on for a couple of years. But the whole impetus was to work Woodrow Wilson, get him to turn around. Meanwhile, the other part of the movement were playing the good girl kind of routine, and were Carrie Chapman Catt and her faction were meeting with him and talking with him and trying to bring him around, and they led efforts during World War I to do women's work, whatever women do during war. And that seems to be what turned him around toward the end, or at least that's the excuse he used when he finally came out before Congress in support of women's suffrage.
He was a stinker.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, he was not good for African Americans, and he wasn't good
No,
for
he
women.
definitely wasn't good
And he
for-
finally came around after this terrible publicity of these women being force-fed in jail. The treatment was just appalling, and I think he came around because he had to come around. He did finally come around, but boy, I'm no fan.
Right.
No, I can understand why you wouldn't be a fan, and why I wouldn't be a fan. But I think the way the women handled it, you know, just the constancy with which they kept bombarding the White House, you know, the picketing, and because, of course, it was during wartime, they got so much criticism from so many Americans. It was said, white Americans saying, you know, you're interrupting the war.
Right.
And but they were so persistent, and I think that's a great lesson.
Right, and they learned that from the British women. The British women had been much more militant in their movement, and Alice Paul had spent time in Britain, not only studying them, but she actually went to jail with them and marched with them and that kind of thing. And Carrie Chapman Catt had gone to observe the British methods. They didn't think they would work in total in the United States, but they applied some principles from them.
And one of the things they did was have marches, not just private meetings in parlors. They decided to organize serious parades of women, and you've all seen pictures of these women in white marching down Fifth Avenue, and that was a turning point, don't you think, Angie?
Yeah, it was a marked turning point when women started occupying outdoor spaces. Nobody was used to women being outdoors, making noise, dressing up, marching down the street. They'd seen male parades and, you know, different societies and what have you, in uniform, and military parades and whatever. But just the sight of the women and the fact that women would not be silent anymore and would not be unseen, I guess, was a big deal. Very big deal.
Well, I think one of the things that struck me about your book, it's the first book I have seen on suffrage, and I am not a, you know, expert on this, but that has really talked about the intersectionality
Right.
between African American and history and American history. It did it in the way it talked about how many of the women were abolitionists before they became suffragettes.
Right.
And I think that's a very important departure. Could you comment on that?
I think it is too. Yeah, I tell people that I didn't set out to write a black book about suffrage, and I didn't set out to write a book about white women's suffrage. I set out to write a book about the suffrage movement in whatever I found. And early on, I found that there were black characters in here that none of us were really all that aware of. Well, I wasn't that aware of a lot of the women, but that they interacted in ways that we don't think about. And the abolition movement is the most important. That nearly all of the women who started the women's movement were abolitionists. And they were on a first name basis with people like Frederick Douglass. And they met with them and they entertained them in their homes and all that sort of stuff. Lucretia Mott that I mentioned, everybody's heard about Henry Box Brown, the man who had himself shipped in a box to escape slavery. Well, one of the first places they bring him is to to Lucretia Mott's house so that she can see him, because they knew she'd get a kick out of this story. And not only were most of these early women abolitionists, they were among the most radical abolitionists in the country. They started a second movement where they would not even use a product that was known to have been made with enslaved labor. Think about it. This takes a lot of trouble. They had stores like we have the Whole Foods, where you could just go buy the free goods, and they called it the free produce movement. So they didn't wear cotton. They didn't trade in cotton. They didn't have sugar during this period. They might not have molasses or rice or anything else you can think of that came from the hands of somebody enslaved in the South. And a couple of like one of the women who was an organizer at Seneca Falls, her family ran one of these stores. So that was interesting to me. And at the same time, almost all of them were, of those first women who organized Seneca Falls, their homes were also known stations on the Underground Railroad. And all through this literature about the women's suffrage movement, every now and then up pops a letter from somebody describing whoever they were hiding last week. Susan B. Anthony talks about outfitting a family to take them over to Canada. Martha Wright, who's one of the organizers, and Lucretia Mott's sister, talks about having hidden someone in her kitchen overnight and then talking to him the next morning. Elizabeth Cady Stanton talks about meeting somebody in her uncle's attic. Well, he took all the young girls in the family up to meet this young black woman they were hiding to get ready to take to Canada the next morning. So it's a big thing in their lives, and they're not ordinary women. They didn't give lip service to abolition; they lived it. And the fact that they started the women's movement is probably no accident. It's more a fact that they were reformers to begin with. And the Quaker women, remember, I guess I mentioned this before, were allowed to speak in their churches and were used to being treated as equal. So they got this thing that they should have their own rights too, and that they should finally start speaking what they believed.
But Angela, they also, if they felt they had to, they would kick black people under the bus and keep moving on with the suffragist movement.
Right. Well, that happened too toward the end of the movement, and I find that one of the things that people do remember and do know, if they knew anything about black women's participation, was that, for instance, during the 1913 march, Alice Paul asked black women to march at the end of the parade, and that included women here in D.C., the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, which had just been formed like 2 or 3 weeks before, marched at the back. Ida B. Wells Barnett pretended she was going to go along with this and hid in the crowd, and then when her state delegation passed by, she marched right on out and got among her white friends and kept walking. So there was that, and then they asked black women, they discouraged black women from going to the convention in Atlanta, and this was at a time they were really courting white Southern participation. White women in the South had not formed their own organizations and had not been particularly active, and this is well up to about 1900. So they were trying to get Southern women into the fold, and they were afraid the presence of black women would offend the white women. And they asked Frederick Douglass, who heretofore had always had a place of honor at their conventions, not to come to Atlanta, because the sight of this big black man on the dais with the other women, with the delicate white women, would not go over well in the South. And they probably wouldn't if they were right. But Ida B. Wells called out Susan B. Anthony on her willingness to be able to cast black women aside just to court the Southern vote. And some other women did too. So.
And I believe that it says in the book that one of the reasons people who were abolitionists became suffragists was because they realized if women couldn't vote, they couldn't get in and pass legislation for to free the slaves.
Yeah, I was interested in how industry banded together against the suffrage movement.
Right.
And that was, we still see that in politics today.
Yes.
Could you comment on that?
Particularly the liquor industry fought against women and were among the major opponents because they feared that women, if they got the vote, would vote like a tribe and would vote for prohibition. And other things that weren't good for industry, like child labor laws, like better salaries for women. So it was, even companies like the railroad lobbies, whoever had big business lobbies at the time, fought tooth and nail, but particularly liquor. And at that point, prohibition had not been passed. And when it did, it wasn't really the women, it was the anti-saloon leagues that got it done.
Well, we're going to be going to the audience for questions in just a couple of minutes, so please get your questions ready. Also, I'm going to ask you to come to the mic on my left, and so that the C-SPAN is shooting this so they can see your faces and can capture your riveting words. And I guess my last question was, looking at where we are today, and I think Carol's questions have really underscored a lot of that. You said you don't think that we could elect a woman for president now, but things might change. What would have to change within the female population in your view, for that to happen?
Right. I don't know if I said that, but I said we have not. I think we can.
All right.
But something has to change. And a part of it is that we have to start thinking as women and set aside, some other concerns if they're not that important. And we have to have the right candidate, I guess, at the right time. But we also have to raise a heck of a lot of money. And people have to get behind whoever that is.
I think the candidate is the big issue. Hillary had the experience, had the publicity, had the, sort of spiritual sense of Americana that made her a good candidate. Right now, I don't think the Democrats have anybody in line, male or female, who sound like a really good candidate to run against Trump. You can't beat somebody with nobody.
Right.
We need a couple of great women to come forward. We have some great women in Congress. We've got some good governors, but I haven't seen anybody, coming forth. Have you?
No, but since we're journalists, there was a very interesting article in yesterday's Washington Post in which they referenced a new study by the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, in which the media was really taken to task for the way they covered the election. And I thought it was a very good article because in many ways they suggested that Trump had been given a free ride, and that the media was equivocating and basically saying that the flaws in Hillary equal the flaws in Trump. And the article went on. Actually, it was a columnist. The article went on to say that to compare those two things was particularly out of line, and asking that journalists start really looking again at how they covered the election. But we're getting past the suffrage movement, aren't we?
Well, just one thing. It was Margaret Sullivan's column. She's the media columnist in the Post. She's awfully good. And her point was that for years, journalists have said, you've got to be fair in every story. You say something bad about somebody, you've got to say something bad about the other somebody. Well, it turned out that there was something bad about Hillary, the emails, and there were a million somethings bad about Trump. And every time you had to write about Trump, you had to throw in the emails, too, making the whole email thing sound like this enormous thing, and making Trump's things, which changed daily, seem amusing. It was a big journalistic problem. I agree.
Yeah, I think we need to look at that as journalists.
We do.
Yeah. So if anyone in the audience wishes to come forward, please do so, and Angela will be happy to answer your question.
I always have to start out to say I'm from the Caribbean. And obviously in the Caribbean, I was lucky to grow up around very strong and dominant women. Extraordinarily strong and dominant women. But we obviously have, all of the problems that exist here. But this leads to two questions. The first question is, I'm from the Caribbean, from the colonized Caribbean, the French-Dutch Caribbean. France, okay? In St. Martin, if you're going to put...
Okay, yeah.
Speaking of, if you're going to put a list together, I come from a reasonably well-to-do family. If you're going to put that list together, man, woman, it's not kind of like, let me throw the list together, you figure out who you vote for. No, it's going to be, and in Europe, obviously, one of the big problems that you all have not referenced here is 100 years after the 19th Amendment, women in America still are very lowly represented in, for example, in political thing and even in businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So would you back, or would you believe that it would be a good idea for something like in France, right, where you got a 50%? Don't forget in Scandinavian countries there's that. In other places in Europe, there are minimum levels, right, 30%, 40%. You have to, simply women have to come in, because the history is if you don't do it, 10 or 15% are going to get voted in. Would you be in favor of that? That's the first
Where
question.
women would have to be 50% of the Congress or something like that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so there'll be, because 52% of the voters are women. I don't see it as wrong-headed. But the second question would be, in relating to Abigail Adams, Remember the Ladies, right? We know that maybe Wollstonecraft, right, had wrote the Vindication.
Vindication of Women,
I
right.
remember that from way Holland when I was in university. But could you talk about that and how maybe did this influence Abigail? Did she read that? And were there other women doing these type of ideas at that time that had influence on it? You know, because this is before the thing.
All right.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if she read the Vindication of Women, but I know that Abigail Adams was very well read for her time. She did not have a formal education so much, but she was allowed to read her family's library, and she did. And she was informally tutored at home. So for her time, she was an extremely well-educated woman. She made that remark as he was going to the Second Continental Congress, not for the Constitution. And as it turned out, the Second Continental Congress did not deal with women's rights at all, or did not specifically draw up any laws as she thought they would at that time. So it was, you know, just kind of a loose confederation at that point. And she probably also, according to historians, did not really have women's suffrage in mind. It wasn't the vote she had so much as you have to remember women had no rights at all. And they couldn't divorce, they couldn't own their own property, they couldn't have control over the custody of their own children. Women did not exist as an entity aside from their husbands if they were married. So she was speaking more to those kind of things that she hoped they would write into whatever they wrote at that point. And they didn't write them into the Constitution later either. So other than New Jersey did give women the right to vote initially in 1776 and took it back around 1807. Does that
answer the second question?
What?
I am not familiar with the 50-50 legislative principle, so I would need to think about it some more.
Yeah,
Sounds
and I would
cool.
too. I didn't answer that, but I had never thought of that concept, but it seems something to explore, but I don't know if it would ever pass in this country. Good.
I think for the 19th Amendment to pass, each of the states had to adopt it individually. And I think actually today, August 18th, 1920, was the day that it did finally pass. So I'm wondering what kind of advocacy the suffragettes had to do with the states to encourage them to pass the 19th Amendment.
There were actually two paths to getting women's suffrage for most of the 1800s and well into the 1900s, I guess, that states could pass a referendum to have women vote in their state. And a lot of the energy from the early suffragists was spent in trying to get these battles won. Somewhere after the 15th Amendment was passed, there was an argument that it also covered women somehow because they were citizens and they were what entity?
They weren't denied.
They weren't denied the right to vote. So some women went around testing it and trying to get the vote that way. That didn't work. But the efforts for state referendums continued, even up to when the 19th Amendment was passed. To pass the 19th Amendment, a certain number of states had to ratify. And Tennessee was the last one they needed to qualify. So.
On vacation in New Hampshire, luckily, I heard just recently about some of the local efforts to get some of the very, very powerful women in New Hampshire into office in the last couple of years. And I worry a little bit about the eggs in the presidential basket. I think there's so much work to be done, not just for women, but for men also, of the politics that some of us might subscribe to. But to get women in at the local and state levels, at the very local jurisdictional to the state levels. I mean, we saw, you may have referenced this, I missed the beginning of your presentations, but the importance of women in the health vote this summer. And so I just wanted to know where you fit this dimension in.
Well, I think women have to start getting into the pipeline, and the local offices are the way to go. I mean, I think unless they're in the pipeline, they're becoming legislators and governors in their own states and senators in their own states.
And who
They're not
puts
gonna-
them up in the pipeline?
They have to come forward themselves, but people have to raise money and go out and vote for them. We all have to go out and vote for 'em.
I have some friends here in the audience who have been going to local meetings of the local district, in this case Democratic Party, and the people who are in charge are stunned because suddenly a meeting that used to attract 12 people has 100 women in it. So if this keeps up, the pipeline will fill up.
Right.
But you can't just try it once and then get discouraged.
No, and it has to be held up also in a very,
Mhm.
very, very strategic way. I really appreciate your discussion of strategy in all of this, so that's what prompted me to raise this question. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this book is a real good indicator of the kind of strategies that we need. We have to review where we've been and what they did to get this passed. But
Yes,
Go on.
thank you so much, Angela. I've been reading this book, and I remember your editing from Black Issues Book Review. Thank you very much for editing that. That really
Thank
made me
you.
a deeper reader.
thank you.
My name is Roan, and I'm a professor or lecturer at Howard University.
Okay.
And two particular points you raised earlier in this talk. You mentioned how forward British women were in terms of abolition. During the time they were fighting for the vote, the Civil War was happening, like in 1866. You mentioned in your book Emmeline Pankhurst, and her daughter Sylvia
Right.
was one of the few women to actually respond to the first wife of Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, when in the last year of her life she was begging for different people to publish her story, which is an amazing story. And Sylvia Pankhurst in England was one of the few. I also really appreciate, Angela, what you mentioned about Frances Harper,
Thank you.
because that very important debate is still so relevant. It's very relevant to Phyllis Schlafly's decision to go with the ERA. I think there's a big analogy between that and Frances Harper's very public disagreement with Elizabeth Cady Stanton
Right.
in the 1886 convention, I believe.
Yeah. Good.
Well, I think Angela describes it best in her book. If she, that's what I was going to ask. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
He's talking about Frances E.W. Harper, who had been a free woman. She was a poet, and she was an abolitionist lecturer, and African American. After the Civil War, there's a meeting where during the Civil War, all of these women's suffrage groups and whatever had stopped meeting. So there's a meeting afterwards where the women and the men get together. Maybe there's a couple meetings really, and she stood up at one of them and said basically that as much as she wanted the vote for herself, that black men should have the vote, and basically that white women needed to get over it at that point. So does that? That's not how I say it in the book, but it's much more eloquent. Trust me.
Good evening. My name is Terry Jastro, and I'm a novelist as well. And a quick statement followed by a question. I actually happen to think that women are the superior race. I do. I think they're smarter. They're more courageous. They're less willing to fight, more willing to negotiate and try to find a common cause. So I actually would advocate strongly that the Senate was made up 50% women and 50% men. So each state would have to send one of each. That's
Right.
how I stand on the thing. So here's the question. I ask it to the panel. It seems like the last election was more a referendum on people being tired and disenfranchised of national government, and so a guy from the business community was elected. Would it be interesting for women, because we have a tremendous amount of really great women who are heads of companies and from corporations, would it be interesting to explore having a great CEO run for the presidency?
Yes, I think. Right. I think it
Of course, I meant female.
Right.
Female
Right.
CEO.
I think that could be interesting, and maybe that would interest people or somehow capture their imagination. But I'm not sure that the first woman president is going to come out of business.
I think the first woman president may come out of the U.S. Senate. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got Kristen Gillibrand, we've got,
Kamala Harris.
right, and what's her name from Massachusetts, who's so fabulous, Warren.
Elizabeth Warren.
Pocahontas, as Trump
Right.
called her. I mean, there's some good women there, but I would really hope that one of the lessons we have now is that you need somebody who does understand government to be running, to be in charge, because a person who doesn't know and isn't even interested in the details of legislation, which is what we have now, is not going to get those things done. So I would vote for somebody to come up through through local politics, and it might be a Republican and it might be a Democrat, or who knows, those parties may shatter the way things are going and we may end up with some new format, but I think you gotta pay your dues
Right.
first.
And it was interesting that it was women who stood up on this health care bill and blocked it. So maybe we're almost there.
They had some help.
Yeah.
Hi. You said at the beginning that you thought you knew the history of suffrage before you started digging into the research. So I'm actually very curious, what most surprised you in your research? What did you find that you just didn't expect to find?
I think I was most surprised at the role men played. And I was surprised by the fact that they were all abolitionists. I mean, that was new to me. I don't think anybody had ever really said that. And I, like everybody else, figured I'd end up writing about a band of white women running around in white dresses and, parading or something. I'm glad that the story was deeper than that, and I would have been happy with a book that basically was predominantly that. I was setting out to write about women. If that was the story, that was the story. But I found that wasn't the story.
My name is Audrey Shepard, and I just kind of live this subject avocationally, and I was the president of Sewell Belmont House, which is now a historic site, and if you haven't been there, you should go. It's now a National Park Service site.
That's one of the headquarters was?
It's where Alice Paul went
Yeah.
in 1929, and where she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment in 1932.
Okay.
After suffrage, but they were there to take advantage of being next door to the Capitol.
Yes.
I think, your panel is great, and having a really good turnout is wonderful. I wanted to make two other quick comments. One is that there is a project at the Wilson Center, Women in Public Service Project, that is trying by 2050 to have 50% men, 50% women in governments worldwide. So I recommend that to you. And the comment I would make, and I'd like your comments on it, is that, and I was in the Clinton administration and so forth, my observation about Hillary Clinton, who I think the world of, was that by definition, the first woman nominee for president in the Democratic Party, of a major party, of either party, would need to have so much credibility, have so much background, and be a first lady and all, because it took so much credibility that by definition she was really banged up and bruised and all that. And I wonder if you think that too.
Well, I think it's with everything else. We have to be stronger, wiser, faster, smarter, whatever,
do it backwards and
right, and do it
high
backwards
heel-
in high
high
heels
heels.
in order to be considered half as equal.
Right.
So, it's,
Right. What else is
it's going to
new?
have to be Superwoman. But we're going, even if she's not, what I'm saying is, women are going to have to band together and say, well, I can do this.
Thank you.
So I haven't fully thought of this question yet, but so I think that going off that idea of having a woman that's like smarter, faster, the high heel thing, how do you think? So having studied the steps of coming to women's suffrage, like having the next step be women's representation in government, do you think that the best approach is to have women? I mean, obviously it's going to be a bit of both, but have women change and have women somehow have to compensate completely as individuals, or have there be, someone mentioned that idea of like 50-50, gender quotas, and you also said that you're not sure if that would ever be possible to have in this nation, and I was just like wondering why, like how we can't see same steps of gaining women's suffrage for gaining women's representation.
I'm not sure I understand
Wow.
the question, but
I think she's saying that why can't it be 50-50? That's sort of it.
is that
Yeah,
ba-
or like
ba-
basically, having the knowledge of studying immensely the coming to the women's suffrage and the women's suffrage movement, like what somehow proclaims the women's representation movement as different and less accessible.
Let me just say one thing. It's in the back of Angela's book. Is a list of each state's female elected people, and you will notice that this number has grown over the years. It was pulling teeth to get the first female elected to the Senate, and the first couple of people who were elected to Congress were actually just filling out their husbands' seats because they'd become widows. So it was a long row to hoe just to get to where we are now, where there are at least a respectable number of women in Congress, and you know, some of them are pretty darn terrific. So sure, it would be great to aim for 50-50, maybe a greater proportion, who knows? But this stuff doesn't happen overnight. as I think I
Yeah, I
mentioned.
don't think it's a bad goal at all.
I think we have to recognize that 54% of white women voted for Donald Trump, who was very clearly sexist, very clearly a groper. Your mic is off. 54% of women and white women voted for Donald Trump, who and did not vote for Hillary, and who was very, obviously, sexist and racist and a groper and, things that he didn't try to hide. So I think we're also talking about some consciousness raising among women, those women who perhaps vote the way their husbands vote. I know I'm not trying to do an analysis of the voting, the white voting population, and there are other reasons, I think serious reasons, that many people did vote for Trump, who thought, I think the evangelicals, were a big part of that. But how do we go about, I think, raising the consciousness of people? How can we make, some of the basic issues are women's feelings of not sufficiently high self-esteem, not feeling they can do things. I mean, there are really, basic things, I think, that have to also be addressed.
Right.
Does that speak to your point?
Right. Let me just add one point, though. The suffragists assumed, and the men who were voting against them assumed, that they would vote as a bloc, and that they would vote in a manner that would clean up politics and that would protect children and women and get rid of liquor and all kinds of horrible things, and society would be perfect because women had the vote. As it turned out, they did not vote as a bloc at all, and they tended to vote more like their husbands. And one of the reasons why they finally got the vote is men began to realize that they would vote like them, that their women would vote like them. So we had a long ways to go where women just haven't been voting in their own interest. So we have to think about that, and what is our interest? We're not all alike, we're not all the same religion, but is there a core of things that we as women kind of need together to do? So,
and it can be men who meet those needs, absolutely, and it can be women who don't. So this isn't a call for us to just vote for women.
Right. Does that answer?
Yeah, definitely interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much. What a great way to spend August 18th, 97 years later. It's really great to be here. So thank you so much for doing this. I come from a long line of outspoken Quaker women, so I hope that I would be interested in this even if I hadn't had that legacy. A couple things that I just wanted to comment on, and then a question. I lead an organization that whose goal is gender parity in our lifetimes, however we define our lifetimes, or however that turns out. And my one of my particular interests in suffrage, and in a number of other social movements of the last century, Title IX, the Voting Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is that they all involve changing rules and systems, not changing individuals. So we didn't simply encourage women to vote or encourage women to try harder or tell them to be more likable or maybe wear pearls or be less shrill. We realized, wow, there's a system that is actually a barrier to women voting. Similarly, somebody mentioned earlier the fact that different countries have different rules and norms. And in fact, many of you probably know the US ranks behind 100 countries in women's representation, 100 countries in women's representation. Here we are, a leading exporter of democracy, allegedly. And those countries, the women are the same. they don't have training programs in those countries. They don't spend money on elections, but they have different rules. They have gender quotas, over 100 countries do. They have different voting systems, more proportional voting systems. They have different legislative norms. So I take that as an inspiration that we can pivot to these rules and systems changes that have the potential to accelerate the progress toward parity. And I think we've got to embrace those systems changes, because it's not happening that somehow the best and the brightest are getting elected. I think we can see from who's in Congress right now.
Right.
That's not happening. But the thing, getting off my high horse, the thing that I've really been struggling with is identity politics, this phrase. I was at a dinner party last weekend, and my dear friend I was sitting next to said, the thing that's ruining this Democratic Party are identity politics. If we could just forget the identity politics, we'd be okay. It'd be smooth sailing. And my husband had to leave the table because my response was so angry. And I said,
I know that feeling.
I said, that's ridiculous. We all have identities. Yes, we all want to be represented, but we're all equal in that opportunity and in the obligation of rules and systems to allow us to all have representation. So I feel like it's particularly poignant this week in America to think about how we relegate to certain identities to being ones that are problem identities, whereas the norm are the identities that aren't white or people of color are not women. And I feel like we've really got to embrace the fact that identities exist, and we need to do everything we can to give those identities voice and not to disparage them or make it seem like we're somehow ruining our opportunity to have power in society.
Right. I think you have to live your identity, and you have to some extent, vote your identity, whether it's as a black woman or as a Quaker woman or whatever it is your primary association is. But there are times when we also have to figure out whether our collective identities can do something together. You know, that doesn't mean that our aims are at odds at all. You may have the same social agenda I do. Even though we don't look anything alike and we don't have the same religion or whatever. I happen to be Catholic. But we have a lot of the same values because of that. So identity is not our problem.
But to many people, identity is the problem. And I think part of that is because they have never really accepted the identity of African Americans, male or female, as it's woven into the fabric of American life. And I think that's what needs to be attacked, so that we're not simply, talking. We're just not spewing phrases, but really trying to get to the bottom of some of the real issues.
Right. And we have to be able to say, this is my identity, but it's not my only concern. Yeah. So I think we can get past that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we have a gentleman behind you.
Hello, my name is Carl Weichel, and I want to address the sentiments of the previous speaker about what strategies, ideas can come forward to elect the first woman president. But I think the Supreme Court, which hasn't been brought up, has to be really looked at, and all the wonderful examples in Northern Europe and in Central Africa where 33 to 40% of women are part of the legislatures. Affirmative action, unfortunately, was limited before it really had its chance to work its process to correct from the long history. So I don't think quotas, unfortunately, in any American system legally will work. Even look what Mr. Sessions is doing now from taking it, reversing the step. So I encourage thinking out of the box, and I have to really think about the most tremendous creative move in America, Supreme Court, was when two opposing people who were against voted for California's proposition to ban same-sex marriage came forward, totally reversed it, almost in sports analogy, came forward with a curveball or however you want to do it, and they, not on what is right should be for these people, but on the civil rights issue, was a really creative coup. So any idea about the idea that Hillary and Bill had way back in the 70s of co-presidencies, or splitting a term 4 years and taking the vice presidency that may be the gateway in, anything like that that may start a dialogue that way might bring a fresh idea. That's all.
I don't know. I think we have to be open and willing to do a lot of things. I don't think that it is sustainable that women stay at the bottom and that women not be represented. So something's going to have to change. And if we have to try some unusual ideas, then maybe we will. So.
We have time for one more question, and a gentleman has the floor.
Thank you. To address one other person's question, there is an organization called Emerge Maryland and similar programs across the country that specifically are engaged in working on training women, particularly in the Democratic Party, on winning a local office and state and federal offices. My question is, your research, can you talk a little bit about your research and what you found out in terms of Henry Ward Beecher, and maybe the irony in that he was the first president of the American Women's Suffrage Association?
Yeah. Henry Ward Beecher is featured in the book, and there's a photograph of him in the book. And he had been active in the movement for some time when he was elected as president of the American Women's Suffrage Association, the splinter group that also decided that it would support the 14th and 15th Amendment. He later became ensconced in a little bit of a scandal, but he's also connected to a lot of other people in the book. So.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge Angela's husband, Michael Days. Is he in the house?
Yes.
Michael is a longtime Philadelphia editor, first for the Inquirer, now.
No, first for the Daily News.
For the Daily News, right?
And briefly for the
Inquirer. Journalists are always correct, right?
He is the author of Obama's Legacy, What He Accomplished as President, which came out last year.
And hopefully it's being carried right here in Politics and Prose.
And he'll sign it for you if you...
On behalf of Angela and Carol, we again want to thank you for your participation, thank you for your presence, and we hope that you will enjoy reading the book and that you will learn as much from it as I did. What about you, Carol?
Yeah, I learned a lot from it, and it's a wonderful source. It has all the dates and all the. If you just wanted to get yourself all fired up, let's just look at the date lines about how long it took to get each of these accomplishments.
I just want to thank everybody for coming, my cousins, my friends, my former colleagues, my former landlord. People like that. But, what I want from this book is for it really to be a conversation starter about these things that we have talked about. And this is probably the best dialogue I've been in so far. So I really want to thank you. People in Washington are really on your toes. So.